The moment the auctioneer called his name, Caleb Lawson smirked and raised his paddle higher. The crowd gasped, murmurs spreading through the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel. The charity auction had been full of outrageous bids, but no one expected the young millionaire to throw down $100,000 for a single date, especially not for her. Sienna Blake stood frozen on stage, her hazel eyes wide with shock. She wasn't a celebrity, nor was she a socialite like the other women auctioned off for charity tonight. She was a schoolteacher, here only because her best friend had convinced her to participate and raise money for children's education. She had expected a few polite bids maybe from an older gentleman who wanted to support the cause. But Caleb Lawson, he was the kind of man people whispered about. Young, powerful, and ridiculously wealthy, he was the CEO of Lawson Enterprises, a company that had taken the tech world by storm. He wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. Sienna had seen his name in magazines, his face on business covers, but never in a million years did she think he'd be bidding on her. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold. To Mr. Caleb Lawson. A round of applause erupted, but Sienna barely heard it. Her breath caught as Caleb rose from his seat and strode toward the stage. He moved with effortless confidence, his tailored black suit fitting him like a second skin. Every step he took toward her felt like a shift in gravity, pulling her into his orbit. When he finally stopped in front of her, she stared up at him, still trying to process what had just happened. "You look surprised," Caleb said, his voice smooth and deep. Sienna blinked. "I am surprised," one corner of his mouth lifted. "Good, I like surprises." She narrowed her eyes. "You just paid $100,000 for a date with me. That's more than surprising." She searched for the right word. "Ridiculous." Caleb chuckled, completely unfazed. "I prefer the word worthwhile." Before she could respond, the event organizer ushered them off stage, congratulating them both. Caleb placed a hand on the small of her back, a light touch, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. "I'll pick you up tomorrow at 7, he murmured, dipping his head slightly toward her. Sienna swallowed hard. "Tomorrow? You didn't think I'd wait, did you?" His smirk deepened before he walked away, leaving her standing there, heart pounding. What had she just gotten herself into? The next evening, Sienna stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down the fabric of her emerald green dress. It was the nicest thing she owned, not designer, but elegant enough for a fancy dinner. She still couldn't believe this was happening. A sharp knock at her apartment door made her jump. She took a deep breath, bracing herself before opening it, and promptly forgot how to breathe. Caleb stood there, looking devastatingly handsome in a black suit. No tie, the top button of his shirt undone just enough to make her pulse spike. But it wasn't just his appearance that stunned her, it was the sheer extravagance behind him. A sleek black Rolls-Royce idled at the curb, the driver standing by the door, and behind the car. An entire bouquet of red roses, not in a vase, but in the hands of two men who struggled to carry the massive arrangement. Sienna gawked. "You're kidding." Caleb lifted a brow. "You don't like roses?" "I do, but this is," she gestured wildly, "too much." "Too much would have been a private jet to Paris," he said smoothly. "This is me being reasonable." Sienna stared at him, wondering if he was serious. The glint in his eyes told her he absolutely was. "Come on," Caleb said, offering his hand. "Let's go." She hesitated, then finally placed her fingers in his. His grip was warm, steady, dangerously comfortable. The ride to the restaurant was silent at first, but not awkward. Caleb glanced at her every so often, as if trying to read her. "You're nervous," he finally said. Sienna exhaled. "You're Caleb Lawson, of course I'm nervous," he smirked. "And you're Sienna Blake, that makes us even." She frowned. "That's not the same thing." "It is to me." His words made something tighten in her chest, but before she could respond, they pulled up to a 5-star rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline. The second they stepped out, the host greeted Caleb by name and led them to a private table candlelit, with a breathtaking view. Sienna shook her head as she sat down. "This is like something out of a movie." Caleb's eyes locked onto hers. "Maybe it is." Dinner went smoother than she expected. Caleb wasn't just rich, he was charming. He asked her about her job, her students, what made her passionate about teaching. He listened, really listened, in a way that made her forget who he was. Somewhere between the wine and dessert, she found herself laughing, genuinely laughing. "You're different than I expected," she admitted. Caleb leaned forward. "Good different." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, good different." He studied her for a long moment, then reached across the table, brushing his fingers lightly against hers. The touch sent a jolt through her. "Then I guess I'll have to keep surprising you," he murmured. Sienna should have pulled away, should have reminded herself that this was just one date. But for the first time that night, she wasn't sure she wanted it to end. As the evening stretched on, Sienna found herself swept into an unfamiliar world, a world where time slowed, where candlelight flickered against the city skyline, and where a man like Caleb Lawson looked at her as if she were the only thing that mattered. But this wasn't her world. When the waiter cleared their plates, Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unreadable expression. "Come with me," he said abruptly. Sienna blinked. "Where? You'll see." Before she could protest, he was already on his feet, offering his hand. Something in his gaze made it impossible to refuse. Against her better judgment, she let him lead her away from the table, past the murmuring diners and toward a private elevator tucked in the corner of the rooftop. The moment the doors slid shut, a hush settled between them. The soft hum of the machinery was the only sound as they ascended even higher. When the doors opened, Sienna gasped. They had stepped onto a secluded rooftop terrace, even more breathtaking than the restaurant below. Twinkling fairy lights wove through the railing, and a single grand piano stood in the corner, its polished surface gleaming under the moonlight. "You planned this?" she asked, incredulous. Caleb smirked. "I like to be prepared." She shook her head in disbelief. "And what exactly am I supposed to do here?" Instead of answering, Caleb moved toward the piano, running his fingers over the keys before playing a soft, haunting melody. Sienna's breath caught. "You play." He didn't look up. "My mother taught me when I was a kid, said it was the one thing money couldn't buy: discipline." There was something different in his voice now, a weight she hadn't heard before. She stepped closer. "She sounds like a wise woman." Caleb's hands stilled. "She was." The past tense wasn't lost on her. A flicker of something unspoken passed between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if shaking off whatever memory had gripped him, Caleb turned toward her, his expression shifting back to its usual confidence. "Your turn," he said, nodding toward the piano bench. Sienna laughed. "Oh no, absolutely not." "Come on," he coaxed. "I just embarrassed myself, it's only fair." She gave him a skeptical look. "You call that embarrassing? That was beautiful." Caleb tilted his head, watching her in a way that made her stomach flip. "Then I guess I'll have to hear what you consider beautiful." Reluctantly, she sat beside him. Her fingers hovered over the keys before pressing down cautiously, forming a hesitant tune. It was nothing compared to his playing, but Caleb listened intently as if she were performing a masterpiece. When she finished, he leaned in slightly, his shoulder brushing hers. "See. That wasn't so bad." Sienna turned to respond, but the words caught in her throat. He was too close. The city lights reflected in his eyes, and for the first time that night, she felt truly unsteady. Before she could make sense of it, Caleb reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was slow, deliberate. "Sienna," he murmured, her pulse pounded. "Caleb, this—" A sudden chime interrupted them. Caleb exhaled sharply, pulling back as he reached into his pocket. His expression darkened when he glanced at his phone screen. "Everything okay?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "I have to take this." Without another word, he stepped away, answering the call as he moved toward the terrace railing. His entire posture changed, shoulders tensed, voice clipped. Sienna watched him, something uneasy settling in her chest. Whoever was on the other end of that call, it was clear they had the power to change him entirely. After a few minutes, he returned, his expression carefully blank. "I have to cut the night short," he said, his voice quieter now. Disappointment flickered through her, unexpected and unwelcome. "Is everything all right?" Caleb forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just business." That was all he offered before leading her back down the elevator, back through the restaurant, and into the waiting Rolls-Royce. The ride back was different. The easy conversation from before had been replaced by a charged silence. When they finally reached her apartment, Caleb stepped out first, walking around to open her door. For a moment, Sienna hesitated. There was something unresolved between them, something unspoken. "Caleb, I'll see you again," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm not letting this be the last time." Before she could respond, he reached for her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The simple act sent a shiver through her. Then, just as quickly as he had entered her life, he was gone, the black Rolls-Royce disappearing down the street. Sienna stood there for a long time, staring after him. She had no idea what just happened, but one thing was certain. Caleb Lawson was going to turn her world upside down. Sienna hadn't expected to hear from Caleb again, not really. Men like him, powerful, busy, untouchable, didn't make a habit of following through. But he proved her wrong the very next evening. A knock at her door startled her just as she was finishing up grading papers at her small kitchen table. When she opened it, she was met with a sharply dressed man holding a sleek black box with a gold ribbon. "Miss Blake," the man greeted. "Mr. Lawson asked me to deliver this personally." She hesitated before taking the box, her fingers smoothing over the expensive wrapping. "What is it?" He said you'd know when you opened it. With that, the man turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, heart pounding. She carried the box to her couch, carefully untying the ribbon. Inside was a single note resting atop black velvet fabric. "Wear this. I'll pick you up at 7. Lifting the fabric, she found an emerald green dress, far more luxurious than anything she owned. The material slipped through her fingers like liquid silk, its elegance undeniable. She should have hesitated, should have questioned whether this was a good idea. But something about Caleb made her reckless, something about him made her want to step into his world, if only for a moment. By the time 7 o'clock arrived, she was waiting at her door, the dress hugging her figure in a way that felt both foreign and intoxicating. And when she stepped outside, Caleb was there. This time, there was no grand display of flowers, no extravagant gestures. Just him, standing beside a sleek midnight blue Aston Martin, watching her like she was the only thing in the world worth looking at. His gaze dragged over her slowly, deliberately. "You wore it." She lifted her chin, despite the heat creeping up her neck. "I figured if you went through the trouble, I should at least try it on." His smirk was subtle. It was worth the trouble. He opened the car door for her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as she slid inside. The gesture was effortless, but it sent a ripple of awareness through her. The drive was quiet, filled with the low hum of the city outside and the occasional glance Caleb sent her way. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. "You'll see." Minutes later, they pulled into a private airstrip. Sienna's breath hitched as she spotted a jet waiting under the soft glow of runway lights. "You can't be serious," she murmured. Caleb simply opened her door. "Come on." She followed him up the jet's steps, her heartbeat uneven. The interior was sleek, modern, and far too luxurious for a simple dinner date. "Caleb," she started as he poured 2 glasses of champagne. "Where exactly are we going?" He handed her a glass, his expression unreadable. "Italy," she nearly choked. "Italy. for dinner." She stared at him, trying to gauge if he was joking. The steady confidence in his gaze told her he wasn't. "This is insane," she said, shaking her head. He took a sip of champagne. "So say no." That was the problem. She didn't want to. The flight was smoother than she expected, and before she knew it, they were stepping off the jet into the crisp Italian night. A black car was already waiting for them, whisking them down winding roads until they reached a villa perched on the edge of a lake. The restaurant was candlelit, intimate, the kind of place people waited months for a reservation. "How did you even arrange this?" she asked as they were seated at a secluded table overlooking the water. Caleb leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I have my ways." She exhaled softly, still trying to wrap her head around the fact that she was having dinner in Italy with a man who had appeared in her life like a storm. The meal was exquisite, every dish carefully crafted, every bite paired with the perfect wine. But it wasn't the food that had her captivated, it was him. For the first time, Caleb wasn't just the untouchable millionaire. He was something more. He told her about his childhood, how he built his company from the ground up, the sacrifices that came with success. And she told him about her students, about the joy and the struggles of teaching, about the dreams she had once had for herself before life took over. "You could still chase those dreams," Caleb said, watching her closely. She smiled faintly. "Some dreams have an expiration date." He studied her for a long moment, then reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "I don't believe that," her breath caught. The air between them shifted, heavy with something neither of them acknowledged aloud. She should have pulled away. Instead, she let him hold her hand. And she knew, in that moment, that she was in trouble. Sienna had always believed there were limits to how much a person's life could change in a matter of days. But sitting across from Caleb in the candlelit Italian restaurant, his fingers lightly tangled with hers, she realized she had been wrong. Everything about him was unraveling her, his quiet intensity, the way he listened, how his presence made the world feel smaller, like nothing else mattered beyond this moment. A waiter arrived with another bottle of wine, interrupting whatever charged silence had settled between them. Caleb released her hand slowly, his touch lingering as he leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed, still relaxed, but there was something deeper there, something unreadable. "I should warn you," he said, pouring her another glass. "I don't do things halfway." Her lips parted slightly before she responded. "I think I figured that out somewhere between the private jet and this view." A smirk played at the corner of his mouth, but it wasn't arrogance, it was something else, something softer. "You think this is extravagant?" Sienna gave him a pointed look. "I think most people would call flying to Italy for dinner a bit excessive." His gaze held hers steadily. "Excessive would be not doing everything in my power to make you realize what you mean to me." Her breath caught. The words were unexpected, unfiltered, and they hit her like a sudden rush of warmth. Caleb wasn't the kind of man to say things he didn't mean. She placed her glass down carefully, trying to steady herself. "Caleb," but he wasn't done. "I knew you were different the second I saw you on that stage, and every moment since then has only proved me right." Her pulse thrummed at his words, at the certainty in his voice. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it carried the weight of something just as powerful. She should have felt overwhelmed. Instead, she felt something dangerously close to surrender. The dinner stretched on, filled with more of those moments, glances that lingered too long, words that carried unspoken promises. And when they finally left the restaurant, stepping out into the cool Italian night, Sienna realized she didn't want the evening to end. Caleb must have sensed it too, because instead of leading her back toward the waiting car, he took her hand and started walking. They wandered through the quiet streets, the cobblestones echoing softly beneath their steps. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the world around them felt impossibly still. At some point he stopped, turning to face her fully. They stood at the edge of the water, the air thick with something unspoken. "I don't want to take you home yet," he admitted. Sienna swallowed. "I don't want to go home yet." The space between them disappeared in an instant. Caleb reached for her, his fingers brushing against her jaw with the kind of reverence that made her knees weak. And then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't hesitant. It was deliberate, like he had been waiting for this moment and was determined to make it last. Sienna melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest, gripping onto his suit jacket as if the world might shift beneath her feet. When he pulled back, just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath was uneven. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he murmured. She knew exactly what he meant. Neither of them had expected this to be more than a single night, more than a fleeting attraction. But it was, and there was no pretending otherwise. The flight back was different from the one before. There were no lingering questions, no hesitations. Caleb sat beside her, his arm draped across the back of her seat, his fingers tracing slow, absent-minded circles along her shoulder. It was a quiet sort of closeness, one that didn't need words. By the time they landed, the city had settled into its late-night hush. Caleb walked her to her door, his presence filling the small space between them. She turned to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is dangerous." He lifted a brow. "For who? For both of us." Caleb exhaled slowly. "Then I guess we're both in trouble." And just like that, he kissed her again, slow and deliberate, as if sealing something unspoken between them. When he finally stepped back, his thumb brushed against her cheek one last time before he murmured, "I'll see you soon." And this time, she didn't doubt it. Because whatever this was, whatever they had become, neither of them had any intention of letting it go. The days following their return from Italy were a blur of stolen moments and quiet intensity. Sienna hadn't meant to let herself get swept up in Caleb's world, but it was impossible not to. He was persistent without being overbearing, confident without arrogance, and every time they were together, she found herself falling deeper into something she couldn't quite name. It started with small things. A car waiting outside her school at the end of the day, a driver informing her that Caleb had arranged for her to be taken home instead of catching the crowded subway. Then there were the spontaneous calls in the middle of the night, his voice low and unguarded as they talked about everything and nothing. But it wasn't just the grand gestures that unsettled her, it was the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. The way he listened with an attentiveness that made her feel like the most important person in the room. And that scared her, because men like Caleb didn't settle. They conquered, they acquired, they moved on, and she wasn't sure she could survive being someone he left behind. One evening, after a long day of teaching, she stepped into her apartment and froze. Her entire living room had been transformed. Soft golden light bathed the space, candles flickering on every available surface. The scent of something rich and decadent filled the air, and at the center of it all, Caleb stood, sleeves rolled up, a pan in his hand as he stirred something over the stove. "You're cooking?" she asked, still standing in the doorway, momentarily disoriented. He glanced over his shoulder. "I had to find some way to impress you. Thought I'd try something other than private jets this time." She laughed despite herself, stepping forward. "You do realize you don't have to impress me, right?" Caleb set the pan down and turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I just like seeing you surprised." And just like that, the tension between them shifted, deepened. She swallowed, looking around the room. "How did you even get in here?" he smirked. "Your best friend might have given me a spare key." Sienna made a mental note to have a very stern conversation with said best friend. But right now, she was too caught up in the moment. in the way Caleb was watching her like she was something he had no intention of letting slip through his fingers. He gestured toward the dining table where 2 plates were already set. "Sit." "Eat," she obeyed, mostly because she was curious. Caleb didn't seem like the kind of man who spent much time in a kitchen, but as she took her first bite, her eyes widened. "This is." She chewed slowly, savoring the flavors. "This is actually incredible." Caleb took a seat across from her, a satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. "Good to know I'm not entirely useless outside of a boardroom." Sienna shook her head, setting her fork down. "That's not what I meant." His expression softened slightly. "I know." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the candlelight casting flickering shadows across the walls. It was the most domestic thing they had done together, and somehow it felt more intimate than the extravagant dates or stolen kisses. After dinner, Caleb leaned back in his chair, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Stay with me this weekend." Sienna's breath hitched. "What?" "I don't mean anything you're not ready for," he said quickly, sensing her hesitation. I want more time with you, no interruptions, no one else." She hesitated. Spending time with Caleb in controlled doses was one thing, but a whole weekend, that was dangerous. And yet, her heart told her she had already made the decision before he even asked. "Okay," she whispered. Something flickered in his gaze, relief maybe, satisfaction. Whatever it was, it made her stomach tighten. The weekend arrived faster than she expected, and when Caleb picked her up, she was surprised to find that they weren't heading to some extravagant getaway. Instead, he drove them to a secluded house on the outskirts of the city, nestled among towering trees with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a quiet stretch of water. It was beautiful, but not in the ostentatious way she had come to associate with him. It felt personal. "This is yours?" she asked as he led her inside. He nodded. "I come here when I need to get away from everything." Sienna glanced around, taking in the warmth of the space. It was unexpected, cozy, intimate. "You don't bring people here often, do you?" she guessed. Caleb's gaze darkened slightly. "Never." The weight of that admission settled between them, unspoken but understood. The weekend passed in a blur of stolen glances and quiet confessions. They cooked together, walked along the water, talked about things that went beyond business and careers. And one night, as they sat outside under the stars, Sienna realized something terrifying. She wasn't just falling for Caleb, she already had. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next, because looking at him now, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Caleb Lawson had no intention of letting her go. The weekend retreat with Caleb had been nothing short of transformative, leaving Sienna with a lingering warmth that refused to fade even after they returned to the city. The quiet intimacy they had shared in that secluded home had stripped away the layers of uncertainty, leaving something raw and undeniable between them. But reality had a way of creeping back in. The following week, Sienna found herself thrown back into the rhythm of her life at school, her days filled with lesson plans, grading papers, and trying to ignore the way her heart leaped every time her phone buzzed with a message from Caleb. And yet, something between them had shifted. It wasn't just the lingering looks or the stolen moments anymore, it was the way he became a presence in her life, effortlessly weaving himself into her world. One afternoon, as she walked out of the school building, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against a sleek black car. Caleb stood there, his sleeves rolled up, the late afternoon sun casting a golden hue over him. Her stomach flipped. "You're early," she said as she approached, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened. He glanced up, a small smirk playing at his lips. "I was in the area." Sienna raised an eyebrow. "You just happened to be in the area," Caleb shrugged, but his eyes held something softer. "Maybe I wanted to see you." Warmth spread through her, but before she could respond, a small voice interrupted. Miss Blake. Sienna turned to see one of her students, Ava, standing a few feet away, clutching her backpack straps tightly. The little girl's eyes flickered between her and Caleb with open curiosity. Ava, what are you still doing here? Sienna asked, concerned. My dad was supposed to pick me up, but he's late again, Ava mumbled, kicking at the pavement. Caleb's gaze sharpened instantly, scanning the empty sidewalk. She can't wait here alone. Sienna nodded, already pulling out her phone. She had met Ava's father once before, a well-meaning but overworked man who often struggled to keep up with his daughter's schedule. Let me call him, she said, stepping aside. Caleb crouched down to Ava's level, his expression shifting into something unexpectedly gentle. Do you like ice cream? Ava's eyes widened. Yes, he glanced at Sienna. What do you think? Maybe we take her for a scoop while we wait. Sienna hesitated for only a second before nodding. I think that's a great idea. Minutes later, they were seated at a small outdoor cafe, Ava happily digging into a bowl of chocolate ice cream while Caleb listened intently to her enthusiastic ramblings about her favorite books. Sienna watched, something tightening in her chest. She had seen Caleb in many different lights: the confident businessman, the charming flirt, the man who had whisked her away to Italy on a whim. But this, watching him talk to a 7-year-old with genuine interest, making sure she felt safe and heard, this was something entirely different. Something that made her heart ache in ways she wasn't prepared for. Eventually, Ava's father arrived, flustered and apologetic. Sienna reassured him that everything was fine, and as they walked back to the car, Caleb remained quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. She reminds me of myself at that age, he admitted. Sienna glanced at him. How so? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, always waiting for someone who was too busy to show up. Her heart clenched at the quiet admission. For all his confidence, there were parts of Caleb that were still unspoken wounds lingering beneath the surface. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. He glanced down at their intertwined fingers before looking back at her, something unreadable in his gaze. You're not that kid anymore, she said softly. His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. No, but I remember. That night as they lay together in his penthouse, Sienna traced lazy patterns on his chest, her thoughts tangled. She had fallen for him, completely, irrevocably. And it terrified her. What are we doing, Caleb? She whispered into the darkness. His fingers brushed through her hair, his touch slow and deliberate. We're figuring it out, she swallowed. And what if it doesn't work? He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression serious. Then I'll fight for it. The certainty in his voice sent a shiver through her. Because for the first time, she believed him. The next few weeks passed in a blur of late-night conversations, unexpected surprises, and a growing rhythm between them that felt impossibly natural. Until the day everything changed. Sienna had just finished her last class when her phone buzzed with a message from Caleb. Come to my office. Now. Her stomach twisted at the urgency in his words. By the time she arrived at Lawson Enterprises, she was ushered straight into Caleb's office, where he stood by the window, his hands clenched into fists. What's wrong? She asked, her heart pounding. He turned, his expression unreadable. My company is under attack, Sienna frowned. What do you mean? Someone leaked confidential documents. Investors are pulling out. The media is circling like vultures. He exhaled sharply. I know who's behind it. An old rival who's been waiting for the perfect opportunity. Sienna stepped closer. What can I do? His eyes softened for the first time since she walked in. You're already doing it. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. You'll fix this. Caleb let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. You have more faith in me than I do. She tipped her chin up. Then borrow some of mine. The crisis lasted for days, but true to form, Caleb fought back with the same relentless determination that had made him the man he was. By the end of the week, the tide had turned and his company stood stronger than before. And through it all, Sienna remained by his side. The night of the company's recovery gala, Caleb pulled her onto the dance floor, his hands firm at her waist. "You stayed," he murmured. She looked up at him. "Of course I did." His grip tightened slightly. "I don't think I've ever had someone do that before." Sienna smiled softly. "Then I guess this is a first for both of us." And as he kissed her, slow and deep, surrounded by the glittering lights of the city, Sienna realized something. This wasn't just a whirlwind romance or a fleeting moment. This was real, and she wasn't going anywhere.